So 40k has a bit of a problem with its setting, right? Particularly with the portrayal of the Imperium of Man, the main protagonist. The Imperium of Man is meant to be the worst place to live imaginable, a horrible example of an interstellar empire. But despite Games Workshop stating that, there seem to be a vocal minority of the fanbase who don't quite get the joke and seem to like the Imperium a bit more than they probably should. In this video, I'm going to suggest how Games Workshop could change that without retconning anything or losing any of the current impact of the setting. So the Imperium of Man is terrible. It's an authoritarian, oppressive, intolerant, incredibly conservative, xenophobic state that allows no other option to exist in the galaxy. And also, it's fascist, right? Well, I could do a whole video on that subject, and we could argue over the exact definition of fascism and if the Imperium fits that description, but it's actually irrelevant, because like the First Order in Star Wars, the Imperium is coded fascist. Lindsay Ellis has a great video about this, but in short, the First Order, and to a degree the Empire in Star Wars, have a pretty incoherent actual philosophy, but you're meant to look at this and be reminded of this. You're meant to look at uniforms like this and be reminded of this. They're code words for this is bad, and the Imperium of Man works in a similar way. We're meant to see the xenophobia, the incredible conservatism and tradition, the obsession with purity and pure genetics, the worship of militarism and creating superhumans as, well, this. And yeah, there's loads of other stuff in there too, the criticism of treating people like numbers, or of overly bureaucratic authority, or of hereditary monarchies and nobility. All this stuff is how we know the Imperium is bad, right? Because it references bad things from our world. And like in Star Wars, one of the biggest references for bad things in our world is fascism. That's not a problem inherently though. Having an evil empire who are evil and do evil things and are stated to be evil isn't a problem in a setting. In 40k, the idea is that the Imperium are an evil empire. In fact, every faction is pretty bad, and that's a really good idea in a war game. It means that your war game isn't justifying war. There's no noble faction fighting the good fight in 40k. In 40k, war is hell, and the factions engaging in it are all awful in their own way. Also, we should remember this setting's designed for a game, and having all the factions be bad makes it way easier to justify when your Space Marines end up fighting your friends' Space Marines. It's not even necessarily a problem if the protagonists of the setting are the evil guys. Like its 1980s contemporary, Mega City 1, the inherent horror of the original 40k setting was leavened by the fact that it was clearly meant to be an absurd, dark joke. Rogue Trader, the original 40k sourcebook, was full of black humor. It was ridiculous and it was satirical, referential of things happening at the time. This is an Imperium that named Space Marine chapters after Greenpeace ships, had Inquisitors called Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. You weren't meant to take the setting seriously. Also, a lot of old 40k happened on the fringes of the Imperium. From Logan's World, the setting in the back of the Rogue Trader book, to the Badab War, the general story of the Imperium was that of permanent rebellions and frontier settlements where Imperial law just didn't really work as well. Like Mega City 1, it was over the top, grotesque, very, very silly, and absurdly dysfunctional. Any satirical intent in that was obvious. But over time, as the setting and the game itself expanded, two big things changed. First, as the game expanded and looked for a younger audience, well, it needed a poster faction. Heroes to sell, right? And this sort of became the Space Marines. It had kind of always been them, but previously they'd been depicted as barely more than crazed psychopaths who were permanently rebelling. As the setting grew more mainstream, the aspect of Space Marines as noble warrior monks became more and more prominent, resulting in a world where these abused, intolerant, mass-murdering child soldiers are only ever portrayed from the Imperium's point of view, as genuine heroes. This is like Star Wars but with no rebels, where the stormtroopers are our lead characters doing the good work of the First Order. Black Library authors have occasionally found ways around this, either by focusing on microcosms of the world rather than the Imperium as a whole, or by presenting characters that break the mold by just not being as brutal as the rest of the setting suggests they should be. But that nuance rarely makes its way into the main source material for the setting, the codexes and campaign books and rulebooks and video games that people use as entry points. In those, while there's the occasional note about how it's a bad universe, characters like intolerant Marines and brutal commissars are overwhelmingly portrayed as heroes. Second, as the setting expanded, it started to justify the Imperium. As concepts like the Warp or the Horus Heresy were fleshed out, the Imperium became less of an oppressive state and more of a necessary oppressive state. In the world of 40k right now, the justification for the Imperium's actions is that without them, humanity would be doomed. The result is a body of work which spends vastly more time portraying the Imperium as a necessary evil, and the Space Marines and Commissars within it as noble heroes, than it does pointing out that they're bad. It may be the unintended development of 30 years of game design, but we've ended up with a setting that states that sometimes the horrible fascist option might be the only way. And when we have a setting like that, it attracts people who agree. Anyway, the upshot is 40k can have a bit of an unsavory reputation in the wider gaming world for attracting fascists. And while we all know it's a tiny minority, it's a big enough problem that Games Workshop have had to make multiple statements condemning being a fan of the Imperium and confirming that, despite almost everything they release saying the opposite, the Imperium is still totally meant to be satire. If you have to explain that, then it isn't working. So, how do we change that? Making the Imperium nice would be a pretty big retcon, and the setting would lose much of its power, I think. Stopping writing everything from the point of view of the Imperium would also help, but that's quite difficult when they're the only human faction. But I think there is a way you can keep the Imperium basically the same, but remove it as a necessary evil, and since 40k now has a progressing storyline, it's not even that difficult to do. Here's my suggestion. Warhammer 40k 10th edition is released, and just like the last two editions, the timeline has moved forwards. The Cicatrix Maledictum has spread across the galaxy, vomiting forth legions of chaos and Xenos and cutting off vast sections of the Imperium. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade has rallied the defenders, doing a good job of shoring up the new, reduced frontiers of the Imperium, but the tendrils of the Cicatrix continue to spread, isolating more and more of the galaxy from Imperial control. The core of the Imperium is intact, shored up by its embattled military, but by now whole sectors have been cut off for hundreds of years and had to survive as best they can. Many of these areas continue to think of themselves or declare themselves as Imperial, at least on the face of things, lest the warp storms calm and the Hammer of the Emperor return. But how much lip service they actually pay to Terra and its institutions varies. The 10th edition setting opens with this, a divided galaxy with a few big human factions and the implication that there are loads of smaller ones. The biggest of these, by far, is still the Imperium, struggling to hold what it can together. As Lord Commander of the Imperium, Guilliman's tendency is for unity at any cost, but even he realizes that, for now, with chaos at the gate, alliance might have to replace conquest. This opens the way for all sorts of new stories. What about an area that was taken over by the Helots of a Destroyed Astartes chapter? An industrial zone completely run by mercantile contracts? Human empires allied to the Tau or in league with other Xenos? Areas cut off from the Mechanicum, but who seem to be doing fine developing their own technologies? Petty kingdoms, freedom fighters, new republics, some of them fall without the support of the Imperium, just as the Imperium always said, but loads of them do just fine. Suddenly the great lie of the Imperium is exposed. Maybe it isn't the only way. Other human civilizations are possible, living in the shadow of the retreating empire like post-Roman Europe. The other factions don't need to be perfect or even much better, just different. And it's worth saying that all of this is currently in the 40k background. Sectors that jealously guard their own affairs have always been there. Ilara's Veil from Spear of the Emperor has been isolated on the far side of the Rift for 200 years at this point and is outright hostile to the rule of the Imperium, with pretty good reason. The Horus Heresy gives us multiple human empires that existed before the Imperium, like the Interrex, who managed a powerful stellar empire, coexisted peacefully with local aliens, and were sensible enough about the dangers of chaos to house a demon weapon in a museum without any significant threat to their society. Even Dan Abnett's Blood Pact from the Gaunt's Ghost books, who are chaos worshippers, maintain a functioning human society in the sanguinary worlds, and have done for centuries. The idea that other human societies are possible and stable has always been in 40k. They just tend to get steamrolled by the Imperium. Anyway, in 10th edition, the setting then moves its focus to those areas on the borderlands, like Star Wars or Firefly or the Calixis sector or Necromunda or the original Logan's world. The interesting parts are the grey areas, where the authority of the Imperium isn't quite as clear-cut as the Imperium would have you believe. New stories, new heroes. You have pirates, mercenaries, new states, and the evil old Imperium lurking in the background. You want the Imperium like it's always been? Great, you can still have them. This idea involves no retcons. But now there's other options too. Factions who are openly hostile or obviously doing better than the Imperium, but who don't get immediately portrayed as heretics and wiped out in the next paragraph. And because of that, it's impossible for anyone to say the Imperium is a necessary evil. The Imperium think that, but it was never necessary, and the tragic fact that it existed for 10,000 years in spite of that keeps the setting just as grimdark as ever. Anyway, there's probably other options, but if I was writing the grand narrative of 40k and wanted to write myself out of the corner I think it's in, I think that'd be a pretty good way of doing it. If you've got a better idea, let me know. Thanks for watching. If you'd like more musings on the background of 40k or how it's changed over the years, then check out the videos below. There's probably one coming up on the right, and click all the usual things you click on a tabletop gaming channel. See you next time.